second method, and that is for the central bank to purchase assets from the non-bank sector. Because when the central bank purchases assets from the non-bank sector, which is a bit unusual, but QE was a sort of unusual, unorthodox monetary policy proposal. When the central bank does that, the asset sellers, let's say, it can be anything, can be pension funds owning bonds, as a simple example, but can be anything really. The seller has an account at a bank, and that account at the bank is now credited with the money from the central bank buying the assets. And therefore, the bank now creates a new deposit on the liability side of the bank, which adds to the money supply. And there's new purchasing power now in the economy. That policy, the Bank of Japan, for 20 years, been saying, we can't do that. That's impossible. What is he talking about? Well, funny enough, in March 2020, the Bank of Japan suddenly did it. It suddenly knew exactly how to do it. And the ECB did it, and the Bank of England did it, and the Federal Reserve did it. But it did it at the time when there was no decline in bank credit. My advice to Japan in the 1990s was when bank credit was collapsing, was going to zero, and also contraction, negative credit growth. And then you need to stimulate it. My proposal, the 2 types of QE, there's also some other policies, but these are the key ones. The proposals to expand bank credit again, then you get a recovery. But they adopted this in March 2020 at a time when bank credit was very strong in most countries already, and made it even stronger. It was an excessive monetary expansion. And at the same time, they imposed restrictions on businesses to close down movement of people and so on. So the supply side was restricted. Now, what happens? If you restrict the supply side and you increase the demand side extraordinarily, the biggest perhaps in the post-war era, you must get inflation. And that's what we got.
Okay, I see. So, Richard, so how do you evaluate the contribution of quantitative easing to the economy overall? I know that different countries adopt different type of policy at a different type of time. Then overall,
yes.
How do you evaluate its contribution?
Yes. Well, I would say there's 2 aspects of the contribution. One is that it's really in the name already, quantitative easing. One contribution is to make people aware that when we talk about monetary policy, it is not always just about the price. Because in English language, modern economics for the last 200 years, since David Ricardo's classical economics onwards, Alfred Marshall Keynes, monetarism, Friedman, new classical, contemporary monetary economics, the whole history, they've always emphasized prices, including the price of money. And that's a phenomenon when you use an equilibrium framework, then prices are key in equilibrium. But what quantitative easing has shown is that we should not neglect the quantity side of things, not just the price of things, but also the quantity. And that's particularly important when markets are not in equilibrium. Then you'd expect quantities to be more important. And as the name suggests, quantitative easing is essentially a statement saying, well, quantities can be extremely powerful, and perhaps they're even more important than the price, like interest rates. So that's one contribution. It's a sort of fundamental contribution. The other contribution, more on the policy side, is I think it's been demonstrated to have a significant impact. But of course, like any powerful tool, you have to be careful in how you use it. Any tool where you work in a workshop or in the garden even can also be dangerous if you use it wrongly, and maybe you hurt somebody. So any tool is also responsibility. And we have to use it wisely. And I'm afraid central banks have not always used it wisely. So I would say there is a significant contribution, both in terms of theory and also in terms of practical application. And on the practical application, I would just caution that we have to use it wisely and appropriately. And it was a tool developed for weak economic growth and a collapsing banking system to help in that emergency situation. And therefore, we should use it in those times, not when we actually restrict supply and we already have strong demand and it's going to cause inflation.